Rain hung over Havana that night like a heavy, unspoken confession, thick, metallic, and trembling on the edge of release. The city, usually restless even after midnight, had fallen into an unusual stillness. No footsteps echoed in the narrow streets. No radio hummed from open windows. Even the sea, which normally crashed its defiance against the Malecon, now murmured quietly, as if sensing the weight of the moment. Inside a modest house tucked deep in the capital, a single room burned with light. The shutters were drawn, the doors locked, the guards at their posts instructed not to disturb under any circumstance. Within that room, Ernesto Che Guevara sat hunched over a wooden desk, a pen in his hand, and a storm in his chest that threatened to split him open. His fingers trembled, not from fear, he told himself, but from exhaustion. Yet Che understood his own lies better than anyone. He had faced bullets without blinking, survived jungles that swallowed weaker men whole, and outwitted armies trained by the world's most powerful nations. But tonight, as he stared at the blank page before him, he was terrified. Because this time, the enemy was not a government, not an army, not an ideology. This time, the enemy was truth. Che exhaled shakily. The pen touched the page. He hesitated. Will you write when you are about to disappear? For a moment he simply listened, to the faint rustling of palm leaves against the roof, to the rain that finally began to fall in soft, hesitant drops, to the far-off rumble of thunder rolling over the Caribbean. The world seemed to be holding its breath with him. Then he began. To my beloved Cuba. The first words bled into the paper like a wound opening. A surge of emotion hit him, so violently he nearly dropped the pen. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe. A lifetime of memories flooded through him. The smell of gunpowder in the Sierra Maestra, the jubilant cries when Havana fell to the revolution, Fidel's hand gripping his shoulder the night they announced victory. But along with those came other memories, ones he rarely allowed himself to touch. The laughter of his children, the curve of Aleda's smile when she teased him about forgetting his boots, the warmth of comradeship around campfires during long marches. He clenched his jaw. This letter would not be to Fidel alone. Not this time. This letter was for Cuba itself, the land, the people, the revolution, the dream, and for the ghosts that would remain after he vanished. He wrote again, I leave not because I no longer love you, but because love alone cannot sustain a revolution that has wandered into shadows. His hand paused. His breath hitched. Yes, this was a truth, the truth he had carried, buried, hidden beneath orders and strategies and speeches. Cuba had changed. The revolution he had helped ignite with blood and conviction had begun shaping itself under different winds. Soviet winds, cold winds, winds that made him doubt whether the path ahead still belonged to the dream he had once chased with such violent certainty. Yet saying it aloud, even on paper, felt like treason. He pushed on. I have fought beside giants. I have shared bread with the brave. But the revolution must not become a monument carved by foreign hands. I fear that path. I fear what it may demand of you, and what it may corrupt in us. His throat tightened. The words tasted like betrayal. But what he feared more than betraying Fidel was betraying the truth. A sudden knock cracked through the silence. Che stiffened. His eyes darted to the door. Commandante, came a voice, one of the guards. Che masked his voice with a steady calm. Everything is fine. Do not disturb me. Yes, Commandante. Footsteps retreated. Che waited until the echoes faded. Then he resumed writing, but his hand trembled even more now. Tonight, secrecy was more than precaution, it was survival. No one could know what he was putting into this letter. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He dipped the pen again, ink dripping like black tears. He wrote of his doubts. He wrote of the bureaucratic stagnation suffocating the revolution. He wrote of his frustration at seeing idealism traded for diplomacy. He wrote of how Cuba's fire could still burn, but only if someone reminded the world what true revolution looked like. He wrote like a man confessing to himself. And he wrote of the children he adored but rarely saw. To my little ones, he continued, I leave you not because I wish to, but because my life no longer belongs to me alone. History calls for sacrifice, and I am shackled to that voice. Forgive me for the nights I will not see your faces, for the stories I will not tell you, for the embraces you must learn to imagine. Che's vision blurred. He blinked hard, but the tears slipped out anyway, splashing onto the page. He wiped them with the back of his hand, angry at himself for this moment of weakness. But it wasn't weakness. It was love. And love, he realized, was sometimes more painful than war. He stood abruptly from the desk, pacing the room like a caged animal. The wooden floor creaked beneath his boots. His thoughts raced faster than his footsteps. Would Fidel understand? Would the people forgive him? Would history judge him as a deserter or a prophet? Lightning cracked across the horizon, illuminating the room in a sudden, violent flash. Che's shadow stretched tall across the wall, thin, tired, but unbroken. He stopped pacing and stared out the small, rain-striped window. Havana glowed faintly in the distance, a scatter of orange lanterns flickering against the darkness. He wondered if anyone else watched the storm that night, unaware their world would soon shift. He pressed his forehead to the cool glass. "Is this the right choice?" he whispered to the empty room. But no answer came. Only rain. He turned back to the desk with renewed resolve. There was no space for doubt now. The letter had to be finished. Time was slipping through his fingers like sand. He sat again and wrote faster. "Fidel, my brother, you have been my compass and my shield. Yet even brothers must walk separate paths when the mission demands different battles. You will lead Cuba to the future. I will take the revolution beyond these shores. This is not goodbye. It is war extending itself through another front." But beneath the ideology, beneath the politics, beneath the fiery conviction, Che added something softer, something almost fragile. "Know that my loyalty to you does not die with my departure. It hurts me to leave, perhaps more than it should, but the world still burns, and I am duty-bound to the flames." He set the pen down, hand aching. The page was only half filled, but the weight of it felt enormous. He inhaled sharply, his chest rising with both courage and grief. Then he wrote the hardest paragraph of all. "If this letter reaches the wrong hands, Cuba will fracture. If it reaches the right hands too soon, it will cause chaos. Hide it if you must. Reveal it only when the people are ready to hear truth without fear. My disappearance must not weaken the revolution we built." His pen scratched across the paper like a blade being drawn. Thunder boomed again. Che glanced at the clock. Nearly 3 in the morning. The hour when ghosts walk and confessions breathe. He added more: memories, warnings, dreams. He described visions of African liberation struggles, of guerrilla warfare in Latin America, of global solidarity movements rising like storms. His words were not just farewell, they were prophecy. When he reached the end, his hand hovered for a long moment. He needed a final line, a truth sharp enough to pierce the veil of history. Finally, he wrote, "If I do not return, do not mourn me. Transform me." He stared at the sentence. It was enough. Che laid the pen down with a soft clatter. His shoulders sagged. The letter sat before him, pages trembling slightly in the warm night breeze. For a moment, he simply stared at it. This fragile piece of paper that carried the weight of a nation, a friendship, a revolution, a soul. He folded it carefully, reverently. Then he pressed it against his forehead, closing his eyes. A silent prayer, or perhaps a plea. The door creaked. Che looked up sharply. One of his most trusted comrades peeked in nervously. "Commandante, the transport for tomorrow is prepared. Everything is ready." Che nodded slowly. His expression softened with gratitude, but sorrow lingered in his eyes. "Good," he whispered. "There is one more thing that must be done before I leave." He placed the folded letter inside an envelope, sealing it with wax. Then he wrote a single word on the front: Fidel. His comrade looked at the envelope with confusion, as though sensing the gravity of what it held. "Should I deliver it?" Che shook his head. "No. I will give this myself." His voice cracked slightly at the end. The comrade noticed, but pretended not to. When the door closed again, Che leaned back in his chair, suddenly feeling the full weight of his life pressing upon him. The storm outside intensified, rain thrashing against the roof like desperate hands. He whispered into the dim air, "After tonight, nothing will ever be the same." And somewhere deep in Havana, perhaps even awake at that very hour, Fidel Castro stirred, restless, uneasy, without knowing that a letter sealed in wax would soon change the course of Cuba forever. Che stood, tucked the letter into his jacket, and blew out the lamp. Darkness swallowed the room. Only the rain remained awake to witness the moment a revolutionary prepared to vanish from the world. The morning crept into Havana with the hesitation of a wounded animal, slow, breathless, and quiet. Pale sunlight pressed weakly against the shutters of Che's room, painting thin gold lines across the desk, where ink stains still glistened from the night's confession. The storm had passed, but the air felt dense, as if the rain had washed away certainty instead of dust. Che sat on the edge of his unmade bed, boots still on, uniform rumpled from hours of restless thought. He had not slept. His pulse felt like a ticking bomb. His mind was a battlefield where memory, guilt, conviction, and fear crashed violently into each other. The letter, the one he had poured his soul into, lay folded inside his jacket, pressing against his heart like a physical weight. His thoughts drifted to Fidel, brother-in-arms, comrade, confidant, strategist, protector, rival, all at once. How would Fidel react when he read what Che had written? Would he understand the warnings woven between the lines? Would he accept the criticism? Would he feel betrayed? Che exhaled sharply. "He will do what the revolution needs," he murmured to himself. "Even if it breaks him. Even if it breaks me." He stood and walked toward the desk. The chair scraped softly against the floor as he sat again. His fingers brushed the ink bottle, still open from the night before. A drop clung to the rim like a tear refusing to fall. He opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. Reading his own words in the weak morning light felt like facing a mirror that showed not his face, but his soul, naked, unguarded, and painfully honest. He began reading silently, but every sentence echoed in his mind. "To my beloved Cuba." The first lines struck him again with the force of a rifle's recoil. The ink had dried unevenly where his tears had fallen, leaving faint smudges. He traced them gently. Then he read the part about the revolution's drift, how the bureaucracy was growing, how foreign powers whispered into Cuban politics like puppeteers with invisible strings, how he feared Cuba's flame might someday flicker under the shadow of compromise. He had never dared to speak these thoughts aloud. Even the jungles had ears, and Havana had more. Then came the words to his children. "Forgive me for the nights I will not see your faces." He pressed the heel of his palm to his eyes, stopping fresh tears from falling. The image of their small hands reaching for him, their laughter chasing each other around the house, stabbed him deeper than any bullet he had taken in battle. How do you justify abandoning your own blood, even for a cause? Was it noble? Or was it selfishness disguised as duty? He folded the letter back into its envelope. A knock shattered the silence. "Commandante," a voice called. "Breakfast is ready." Che cleared his throat. "Leave it by the door." "Yes, Commandante." He listened to the footsteps fade again. Everyone around him sensed something unusual today, an energy, a severity, but no one asked questions. Not about Che. Not today. The city outside began to stir. Roosters crowed. Vendors called from distant streets. The smell of brewing coffee wafted faintly through open windows. Life went on, unaware that one of its symbols was preparing to disappear from it forever. Che looked at his hands, hands that had held rifles and healed wounds, hands that had pulled comrades from gunfire and signed revolutionary decrees. Hands that had now written a letter capable of destabilizing an entire nation. He had written many things in his life, manifestos, diaries, military orders, but never anything like this. Never something so raw, so human, so dangerously truthful. He rose to his feet, the movement firm, resolute. He needed to reread the letter one last time, before delivering it. Not as a soldier, but as a man. He pulled a chair closer to the open window. The breeze lifted his hair gently as he began reading again, slower this time. His words unfolded like a confession whispered in a church with no priest, no redemption, just truth. Midway through the letter, he paused at a paragraph he barely remembered writing in the haze of the night. I fear, Fidel, that power, when held too tightly, begins to sculpt itself into the shape of a hand that grips it. We made a revolution to free the people, not to bind them with new chains. Che felt the sting of those words. He knew they cut deep. He knew they were dangerous. He knew they might be perceived as accusation, rebellion, even betrayal. He imagined Fidel's face as he read those lines, the frown, the quiet inhale, the flash of hurt that he would hide behind political calculation. Che swallowed hard. Did he have the right to say these things? Did he have the right not to? The revolution, he believed, belonged to the people, not to the figureheads who guided it. If truth was painful, so be it. He continued reading. If my absence is needed to protect the image of unity, I accept it. History will judge both of us in ways we cannot control. But I will not be a silent statue placed where it is convenient. My duty is to ignite, not to decorate. A faint smile tugged at his lips. Yes, that sounded like him. Revolutionary to the end. Stubborn to the bone. A man who refused to be anything but a torch, burning, moving, devouring darkness. Then he came upon the final pages, the most intimate lines he had written. If one day my children ask why their father vanished, tell them this, that I walked toward the fire so they would never have to. Tell them I fought not because I wanted to die, but because I wanted life to mean something. Che's chest tightened painfully. He whispered the words aloud, tasting their weight. So they would never have to. He closed his eyes. Would they understand? Would they hate him? Would they resent history for stealing their father? He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, clutching the letter. No matter how he rationalized it, leaving them felt like ripping out his heart with his own hands. But the world was burning. Africa, Latin America, so many fires, so many oppressed people calling for help. And Che, cursed with the burden of idealism, could not turn away. He stood, pacing again. Someday, he whispered to the empty room, they will understand. They must. There was a part of the letter no one else would expect Che to write, and it was this section that terrified him most. I do not trust the allies who whisper promises into our ears. Their interest is not in our freedom, but in our obedience. Cuba must walk carefully between the giants or risk being crushed under their quarrels. The mention of foreign powers, one in particular, was explosive, unreleasable, dangerous. He knew Fidel could never make these sentences public. Not then. Perhaps not ever. This was the part that made the letter forbidden. This was the part that could unravel diplomatic ties, spark tension, invite retaliation. But Che had never been one for political caution. Diplomacy felt too much like a slow poison. He had always been the fire to Fidel's stone, reckless passion versus steady strategy. Together, they made balance. Apart? No one knew. And now that balance was about to break. Che folded the letter again, running his thumb along the crease. He felt something he had not felt in years. Not on battlefields. Not in jungles. Not under enemy bombardment. Fear. Not fear of death. He had made peace with that long ago. This was fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being erased. Fear of being remembered wrong. He sat down again, feeling suddenly small in the large, quiet room. What if history twisted his words? What if Fidel never released the letter? What if it was buried, forgotten, rewritten? The thought chilled him more than any threat of execution. He wanted the world, his children, his comrades, the future, to understand why he left. Why he had to. Why the revolution could not remain confined to the island. But history was often cruel to dreamers. And Che knew he was entrusting his truth to a man who carried the weight of a nation and the burden of control. Fidel would protect Cuba at all costs, even from uncomfortable truths. Che could only hope he would also protect Che's legacy. The letter, he realized, was both a gift and a burden. It was a confession, yes. But it was also a weapon. A weapon he was handing to Fidel, trusting him not to wield it against him. As he sat with the letter, memories rose unbidden. The mountains, the gunfire, Fidel's laughter echoing in the forest like a rebellious anthem, food shared between marches, the night they planned assaults by candlelight, the moment Batista fled, and they looked at each other in disbelief, as if asking, did we really win? Che had admired Fidel, not as a politician, but as a man unafraid to dream dangerously. But now their visions diverged, and the letter was proof of it. A shadow moved past the window. One of his comrades. Time was slipping away. The aircraft was waiting. Arrangements were finalized. Once he left this house, he would not return. Che pressed the envelope to his lips, whispering a final vow. I stand by my words. Then he slipped the letter inside his jacket and straightened his uniform. The buttons shook under his fingers. He was ready. Ready to hand Fidel the most honest words he had ever written. Ready to vanish from Cuba. Ready to step into the unknown. Before leaving, he walked to the small mirror on the wall. He stared at his reflection. The beard, now flecked with strands of white. The eyes, once burning bright, now carried storms. The face hardened by war, softened by regret. Who are you, he whispered. A revolutionary? A deserter? A fool? He didn't know. But the man in the mirror looked determined. Determined enough to disappear. Determined enough to die for an idea. Determined enough to write a letter that could shake a nation. He lifted the envelope one last time. Let the truth live, he whispered. Then he walked toward the door. Slowly, solemnly. Every step is heavier than the last. When he opened it, morning sunlight spilled in. And Che stepped out, letter close to his chest, toward the moment that would change Cuba forever. Dawn broke over Havana with a muted glow, the kind of reluctant sunrise that seemed to understand the weight it was illuminating. A thick haze clung to the horizon, softening the sharp outlines of the city. As the capital stirred, whispers of routine drifted through the streets. Vendors setting up their stalls, soldiers sweeping the barracks courtyard, mothers waking their children for school. But inside the headquarters of the Cuban leadership, located within the austere walls of a guarded compound, the morning carried a different air entirely. Quiet, watchful, expectant. Fidel Castro had been awake since before sunrise, pacing the length of his office like a restless panther. His mind churned through the complexities of the day. Supply shortages, diplomatic communications, Soviet contacts awaiting replies, intelligence reports from Miami, agricultural directives awaiting signatures. His desk was buried under papers, maps, reports, his usual battlefield. But beneath all of it hummed an uneasy intuition. Something was shifting. Something was coming. He could feel it. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Enter, Fidel called out, his voice calm but firm. The door opened, revealing a young revolutionary officer, the same officer Che had entrusted with delivering him a message. The man looked tense, though he stood at attention. Commandante Fidel, the officer said, extending a sealed envelope. Che asked that this be given to you directly. He said it was urgent. Fidel's brows drew together, a rare crack in his controlled expression. Che, he repeated. Yes, Commandante. From him. He insisted. Fidel took the envelope slowly, as though accepting something alive and volatile. The seal was still warm, its wax deep red, the edges slightly smudged, as if Che had hesitated before stamping it. The single word written on the envelope made Fidel's heart constrict. Fidel. Just his name. No titles. No greetings. Just Fidel. The officer saluted, but Fidel barely noticed. He dismissed him with a distracted nod, eyes locked on the envelope as the door clicked shut again. His fingers traced the edges, feeling the weight inside. Paper, nothing more, yet it felt heavier than any decree he had ever signed. He sat down slowly at his desk, the leather chair creaking under his broad frame. For a long moment, he did not open the envelope. Instead, he stared at it as if trying to divine its contents by will alone. Che rarely wrote to him. They spoke face to face, argued side by side, planned shoulder to shoulder. Written letters between them often signaled high stakes, or personal matters too delicate for witnesses. Fidel inhaled deeply, bracing himself. Then he broke the seal. At first, his eyes moved quickly over the text. Then they slowed. Then they stopped altogether. The room around him seemed to freeze. The hum of the electric fan faded to nothing. The shouts from soldiers outside dimmed into silence. The world narrowed to the words inked on the page. His eyes tightened. His jaw clenched. Lines formed on his forehead, deeper than before. He read the beginning, Che's farewell to Cuba, and felt the first pang of unease. But as he reached the parts about the revolution's drift, the bureaucracy, the Soviet influence, the fear of ideological compromise, the unease twisted into something darker. Fidel lowered the letter slightly, staring into nothing. Che had written what no one else dared to say. Not directly to him. Not about the revolution. Not about the fragile alliances keeping Cuba alive under the shadow of global powers. He continued reading. His lips parted at the paragraph about brothers walking separate paths. Then he reached the words about power, how tightly held authority begins shaping itself into its own image. Fidel's fingers tightened around the paper involuntarily, a tremor running through him. He whispered the sentence aloud as if testing its taste. Power sculpting itself into the shape of the hand that grips it. He set the letter down abruptly. He stood, pacing the room. Che had always been bold, fearless to the point of recklessness. Fidel admired that in him and relied on it. Che was the fire, Fidel the architect shaping its burn. But these words, these were dynamite. If made public, they could ignite the island with doubt, fracture the unity they had fought to forge. His pacing intensified. Then he reached the most personal part, the words to the children. Fidel stopped mid-stride. He read them slowly, more carefully than the rest. Forgive me for the nights I will not see your faces. Something in Fidel's chest cracked. He knew how Che loved his children, how he would speak of them in quiet moments, how he carried drawings in his pockets, how he avoided their eyes whenever duty forced him away. Fidel sank heavily into the chair. He brushed a hand across his face, as if wiping away the ache in his throat. He read on. And then he reached the lines about foreign allies. The warning, the distrust, the fear of being swallowed by giants. Fidel froze. This was not criticism. This was a revelation. And it was dangerous. His fingers traced the ink, the letters, the curves of Che's handwriting. This was not just a farewell. It was a bomb wrapped in confession. He felt heat rise in his face. Che understood nothing about diplomacy. Nothing about political survival. Nothing about the delicate tightrope Cuba walked. But then another thought pierced through his temper. Che wrote this because he believed it. Because he trusted Fidel enough to tell him the truth. Because he could not lie. To Fidel, to himself, to history. Fidel's fury melted into something heavier. A grief he had not expected. He reached the final lines. If I do not return, do not mourn me. Transform me. Fidel let out a slow breath, his eyes closing. The words felt like a punch to the gut. If I do not return. And suddenly, everything clicked. The letter. The secrecy. The tone of finality. Che was not leaving temporarily. He was disappearing. Possibly forever. Fidel slammed his fist against the desk, shaking the lamp. Damn it, Che, he whispered, voice breaking. You always had to choose the hardest path. He stood again, calling out. Guard. A soldier entered immediately. Find Che. Bring him here. Now. The guard hesitated, an unmistakable sign that something was wrong. Commandante, he stuttered. Che has already departed. Fidel's face drained of color. What do you mean departed? He boarded transport at dawn. Under your signed authorization. My authorization? Fidel's voice cracked like thunder. Yes, Commandante. It was signed by your office. Fidel's mind raced. Who had arranged this? Who had signed in his name? Or had he, without realizing the details, approved a departure buried in bureaucratic papers? He dismissed the guard. When the door closed again, Fidel sank back into his chair. He stared at the letter in front of him. The ink seemed darker now, heavier, as if it carried the finality of a man walking into the unknown. A soft knock sounded again. Then the door opened without waiting for permission. Raul Castro, Fidel's brother, closest advisor, stepped inside. His expression was stern, troubled. "Fidel," Raul said quietly, "I heard Che is gone." Fidel slid the letter across the desk silently. Raul picked it up, reading with narrowing eyes. His breathing changed mildly at certain passages. His brow tightened at others. When he finished, he set it down slowly. "So," Raul said finally, "he told you the truth." Fidel frowned. "What truth?" "That he no longer agreed with our path. He said as much to me last month." Fidel's eyes snapped up. "And you said nothing?" Raul hesitated. "Che has always spoken his mind. I thought it was frustration. I didn't think he would act on it so decisively." Fidel's voice softened. "He trusted me," he said. "Enough to confide everything. Enough to walk away." Raul's gaze sharpened. "And enough to endanger us if these words ever become public." The silence that followed was suffocating. Fidel looked at the letter again. He saw not ink, but the shadow of Che's absence expanding over Cuba. "Do you know what this means?" Fidel said quietly. Raul nodded. "If this letter spreads, the revolution's unity shatters." Fidel closed his fist around the pages, crumpling them slightly. "I won't let that happen." Raul's expression tightened. "What will you do?" Fidel stared at the letter for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but heavy with sorrow. "I will hide it." Raul exhaled through his nose, nodding once. "It is the safest choice." But Fidel wasn't finished. "And I will pray," he muttered, almost too softly for Raul to hear, "that Che forgives me for it someday." He stood, walking toward the heavy iron safe built into the wall. He unlocked it slowly, as if performing a ritual. Inside were documents of great importance. Treaties. Classified reports. And now, Che's truth. Fidel placed the letter inside, staring at it for several seconds, as though memorizing the shape of his friend's handwriting even through the envelope. Then he closed the safe, turned the lock, and sealed the forbidden letter away. For a long time, Fidel didn't move. The room felt colder now, quieter, heavier. He walked to the window and looked out over Havana, the city Che loved fiercely, the dream they had built together, brick by brick, bullet by bullet. The city was waking, and Che was gone. Fidel's hand pressed against the glass. "Wherever you go," he whispered, "you will always be my brother." But brothers, he knew, did not always walk the same path. And as the morning sun rose over Havana, Fidel Castro, the leader of a nation, the guardian of a revolution, the keeper of a secret, stood alone in his office, carrying the weight of a letter that might never see the light of day. The sky was still an uneven gray when Che left the safe house, the letter now surrendered, and his future already untethered. A faint drizzle clung to the air, a ghostly remnant of the previous night's storm. The streets of Havana, still rubbing the sleep from their eyes, paid him no attention as he stepped into the half-light. He wore no uniform, no beret, nothing that suggested he was a man whose face hung on posters and murals across the nation. Instead, he wore simple worker's clothes, a faded shirt, patched trousers, an old cap pulled low. A pair of glasses, plain, unremarkable, rested on his nose. They were not for vision, they were for anonymity. He was not Che Guevara that morning, just a quiet man moving through the city, unseen. A final disguise for a final departure. His boots hit the wet pavement with a soft, rhythmic thud. He walked slowly, deliberately, absorbing every detail of the city he had fought to liberate, every crack in the sidewalk, every scent of brewing coffee from a distant kitchen window, every flickering street lamp still lit from the night before. He found himself moving toward the places where memories lived. Not because it was strategic, not because it was planned, but because something inside him, something deeply human, needed to say goodbye. First, he passed the schoolyard where children would soon gather, chasing each other in circles of laughter. He paused at the metal fence, gripping the cold bars. A small girl in a blue dress was already waiting by the gate, swinging her feet, humming to herself. She couldn't have been more than 6. He felt a familiar ache. His own daughter was around that age. He closed his eyes. "Forgive me," he thought. He forced himself to walk on. A few blocks later, he reached a modest park whose benches remembered the nights he had sat there with fellow revolutionaries, debating strategy long after midnight. The trees were older now, taller. Their branches stretched toward the sky, like guardians of forgotten stories. Che walked beneath them, brushing his fingertips along the rough bark of one tree, a tree under which he had once slept while planning an operation in 1958. He remembered the faces of the young men who sat around him then. Some lived. Most didn't. The park was empty now. Only a stray dog trotted past him, sniffing at puddles. Che crouched and rubbed its head gently. "Good morning, compañero," he whispered. The dog wagged its tail. For a moment, Che allowed himself a smile, small, fleeting, but real. He continued walking. The city awakened around him. Doors opened. Vendors arranged baskets of fruit. Soldiers marched in formation down a distant avenue. A bus rumbled by, leaving a trail of diesel smoke in its wake. No one recognized the disguised man who paused at the corner, looking up at the facade of a once-abandoned building now repurposed as a clinic. He remembered standing there on Inauguration Day, shoulder to shoulder with Fidel, cutting the ribbon and declaring it a beacon of free health care for the people. But what he remembered most was a little boy, barely surviving some infection, running out to hug him after treatment. Che had knelt down and told him, "This clinic belongs to you." He wondered where that boy was now. Grown? Gone? Dreams fulfilled? Lost? There were so many faces he would never see again. He walked on. Eventually, his steps brought him to the outskirts of the city. A jeep waited under a cluster of palm trees, half hidden in their shadows. A trusted comrade stood beside it, smoking a cigarette, eyes scanning the horizon with restless intensity. When he saw Che approaching, his expression shifted. Surprise, worry, disbelief. "You came alone?" the comrade asked quietly. Che nodded. "No escort. No fanfare." The comrade exhaled. "You shouldn't have walked. It's dangerous. Someone could have recognized you." Che shrugged. "If they had, I wouldn't be leaving." The comrade swallowed, unsure how to respond. Che opened the passenger door, but paused. "I want to see the city one last time," he said. They both looked out over Havana. The sun was rising now, its rays piercing through the gray clouds and bathing the domes, rooftops, and narrow streets in soft gold. Che spoke again, his voice low and heavy. "As long as I live," he murmured, "this land will live inside me." The comrade flicked away his cigarette. "You don't have to go," he said suddenly, his voice cracking slightly. "You're Che Guevara. If you stay, the people will follow you anywhere. You can fix what's broken from inside Cuba, not from some foreign jungle." Che turned to him. His expression was calm, final, irrevocable. "No," he said softly. "If I stay, I become a symbol chained to a chair, a statue, a memory kept alive by nostalgia. That is not who I am. A revolution that stops moving dies. And so do the men who lead it." He stepped into the jeep. "Drive." The road blurred beneath them as they headed toward the airstrip, an unmarked runway hidden behind sugarcane fields. As they drove, the comrade kept stealing glances at Che. "You didn't tell Fidel, did you?" he finally asked. Che hesitated. "I wrote him a letter." The comrade frowned. "A letter? Che, he deserved more than that." Che looked out the window, watching the passing fields. "Yes," he whispered. He did. But the words in the letter were too heavy, too political, too truthful to say aloud. And saying goodbye face to face might have shattered his resolve. Some farewells, Che believed, were too painful to speak. They arrived at the airstrip just as a thin line of sunlight pierced through the clouds, casting a pale glow over the small transport plane waiting, with engines off. The pilot stood nearby, nervously checking his watch. 2 guards, hand-picked for loyalty, stood at attention. Che stepped out of the jeep. The comrade climbed out after him, his boots sinking into the soft ground. "Che," he began, but his voice faltered. Che put a hand on his shoulder. A firm grip. A reassurance. "Thank you," Che said. "For everything." The comrade's eyes glistened. "Will you come back?" he asked, breaking the silence. Che didn't answer immediately. Instead he looked toward the horizon, where the sky stretched wide and open, where war and uncertainty and purpose waited like distant thunder. "No revolutionary truly returns," Che finally said. "Only their stories do." The comrade blinked away tears. Che offered him a final, sorrowful smile. Then he turned toward the plane. As he approached, the guards saluted stiffly. The pilot avoided his eyes, knowing the weight of what he was witnessing. Che climbed the small steps and turned at the top. Havana lay behind him like an old friend he'd never see again. The breeze carried distant sounds, laughter, engines, birdsong life. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the island's scent one last time. A voice called from the ground. "Che." It was the comrade again. Che met his gaze. "I hope the world treats you better than Cuba did," the man said. Che gave a short, sad laugh. "I don't want the world to treat me better," he replied. "I want it to treat everyone better." He touched the plane's door and hesitated. For a moment, he imagined dropping the disguise, running back, knocking on Fidel's door, telling him he was wrong, that he was staying, that Cuba still needed him. But that was fantasy, a weakness he couldn't afford. The letter in Fidel's hands would speak for him now. Che stepped into the plane. The door closed behind him. Inside, the cabin was small, cold, and metallic. The seats were worn. The smell of fuel crept through the vents. Che sat by the window. The pilot climbed into the cockpit and began preparations. Engines hummed to life, vibrating through the floor. As the propellers spun faster, Che pressed his forehead lightly against the window. The world outside seemed to blur slightly, not from the motion, but from the film of moisture gathering in his eyes. He swallowed hard. My children. Fidel. My comrades. My Cuba. He closed his eyes. Letting go was the hardest thing he had ever done. The plane lurched forward, accelerating across the runway. The guards saluted as it passed. The comrade stood motionless, watching with an expression torn between pride and heartbreak. The ground trembled, dust swirling in the engine's wake. Then the plane lifted. Higher, higher, until Havana became a tapestry of color and memory below him. The sea spread out like a shimmering mirror. The coastline curved gently, familiar, beautiful, haunting. Che watched until the city shrank into a blur, then into a dot, then into nothing. A silence settled over him. A silence of endings. A silence of beginnings. Without warning, a single tear slid down his cheek. He wiped it away, quickly, almost angrily. "Enough," he whispered to himself. "The world still burns." He straightened his posture, sharpening his gaze. There would be new jungles, new struggles, new comrades, new battles. He would start again, rebirth through disappearance. Behind him, Cuba was changing forever. Ahead of him, fate waited with open jaws. Hours later, when the plane touched down on foreign soil, Che Guevara stepped onto a land where no one recognized him. No murals, no cheers, no salute. He took his first step forward, and the legend of his vanishing began. Havana woke to a strange quiet the morning after Che's departure, a quiet no one could name, yet everyone felt. It clung to the air like humidity before a storm. Radios hummed their usual morning broadcasts, street vendors shouted their usual greetings, and buses groaned along their usual routes. Yet something beneath it all seemed unsettled, as if a drumbeat had fallen out of rhythm. Even the gulls circling over the Malecon screeched less than usual, as though the island itself sensed an absence. Inside government buildings, however, the quiet was shattered. By noon, the council chamber in the Palacio de la Revolution buzzed with tension. Ministers hurried in with folders tucked under their arms, faces stiff with unease. Everyone had heard rumors, a mission abroad, a reassignment, an illness, but no one knew the truth. Fidel Castro sat at the head of a long oak table, hands clasped, jaw locked tight. He hadn't slept. Dark circles pooled beneath his eyes, and a half-drunk cup of cold coffee sat ignored beside him. Roll entered last and sat quietly at Fidel's right. He sensed the tremors of something irreversible in the air. "Compañeros," Fidel began at last, voice rough and deliberate, "we have important news." Every head turned toward him. But he didn't speak. Not yet. Not until he had steadied himself. He cleared his throat. "Ernesto Guevara has left Cuba on a mission abroad." A gasp rippled across the room. "He will not be returning for a considerable time," Fidel continued, tone controlled, almost mechanical. "His destination and objective remain classified. Effective immediately, he is relieved of all governmental positions." The silence was suffocating. One official, bold or foolish, finally spoke. "Why poor K? Why now, Commandante?" Fidel's eyes hardened. "That is not a question for today." Another voice emerged. "Did he leave voluntarily?" Fidel's jaw twitched, the smallest of betrayals. He paused too long before answering. "Yes." The room felt the weight of what he wasn't saying. Beyond government halls, the news traveled with unsettling speed. By evening, whispers spread like wildfire through markets and cafes. "Che has left. Che is gone. Che abandoned Cuba." "No," Fidel pushed him out. "No, he went to start another revolution." "No, he's dead." Each whisper contradicted the next, and each grew more dramatic with repetition. In some neighborhoods, people rejected the rumors outright. "Che, leave? Impossible. He loves this country more than his own life. He wouldn't disappear without a farewell." But in others, fear carried heavier weight. "If Che is gone, something must be wrong." "Mira, my friend, a country does not lose a man like that unless something broke." "What are they hiding from us?" Questions swirled everywhere, but answers were scarce. Only one thing was certain. The people felt a strange ache in their chests, a collective sense of instability. As night fell, Havana felt like a city waiting for someone who wasn't coming home. Across the city, in a modest yellow house, Aleda March, Che's wife, sat by the living room window, hands trembling slightly. She held a mug of café caliente that had long since gone cold. The children played quietly in the next room, even though they sensed their mother's unusual stillness. Hours earlier, Fidel had come to her door alone. He had said Che was safe. He had said Che had left by choice. He had said Che was on a mission Cuba needed kept secret. But he had not said goodbye. He had not written to her. He had not kissed his children one last time. Aleda stared at the door long after Fidel left, trying to wrap her mind around the impossible truth. The man who kissed her goodnight 3 days earlier was simply gone. She didn't know whether to be angry or devastated. She felt both. And neither. She wiped her eyes and tried to breathe evenly. Her daughter walked into the room, clutching a hand-painted wooden toy. "Mama," she said, "when is Papa coming home?" Aleda's breath caught in her throat. She knelt beside her daughter and pulled her into her arms, holding her tightly, too tightly. "Soon," she whispered, because it was easier than the truth. "He will write soon." But deep inside, a coldness formed. Che had many faces. The father, the lover, the revolutionary, the doctor, the politician. But the one she feared most was the wanderer, the man who could not sit still while injustice existed somewhere else. She had married not a man, but a flame. And flames do not remain in one place. Across the island, in a dim safe house, Cuban intelligence officers reviewed reports, tracking the reactions of citizens. Some noted rising tension. Others suggested preparing a formal statement. One officer, older and quiet, read the classified report again and again, still struggling to believe what he'd witnessed the day before. He had seen Che boarding that plane. He had seen the look in Che's eyes. It was not the look of a man embracing a glorious mission. It was the look of a man burying something inside himself. "What have we done?" the officer murmured to no one. That night, Fidel retreated into his private office. The secret letter sat on his desk, unopened, unread since dawn. He stared at it as if it were a living thing. He took a long breath and unfolded it again. The paper had begun to wear at the creases from how many times he had handled it. The ink was slightly smudged at one corner, perhaps from Che's hand or perhaps from Fidel's own. He read each line slowly, as though the words were knives he needed to endure one by one. I leave you my empty chair not as a betrayal, but as a final act of service. He flinched at that. We built a revolution together, but we also built disagreements we never resolved. He looked down, shame flooding his chest. You are Cuba's leader, but I must remain a soldier. Fidel rubbed his forehead. His pulse hammered. The letter continued. If I stay, I will become a monument. If I leave, I become a weapon. Fidel crushed the letter against his chest, eyes burning. Why didn't you talk to me, Ernesto? He whispered, voice cracking. Why didn't you let me stop you? But deep down, he knew the answer. Che had always walked alone when the path became unbearable for others. The following morning, Fidel appeared on national television. His face was calm, his voice steady, but the weight of his grief hid beneath his tone. Compañeros, he began, I stand before you to confirm that Comandante Ernesto Che Guevara has left Cuba to carry the flame of revolution to new lands. He has expressed his deep love for our people and has entrusted us with continuing the work we began together. People across the island stopped what they were doing and moved closer to their radios and televisions. Some cried openly, some clenched their fists, some simply stared in frozen disbelief. But Fidel was not done. He has renounced his positions in our government, he continued. Not out of division, but out of conviction. The same conviction that brought him to our shores years ago. Aleda watched from her living room, expression unreadable. The comrade from the airstrip watched from a darkened room, shaking his head in disagreement. And millions of Cubans watched with heavy hearts. But one thing stood out more than the words. Fidel did not smile. Not once. He spoke like a man carrying a stone inside his chest. In the days that followed, Cuba felt unbalanced. Posters featuring Che's image became objects of mourning. Some people lit candles beside them. Others placed flowers. Rumors multiplied with alarming speed. Che argued with Fidel. Che was forced to go. Che ran away. Che is on a mission that will save the world. No, Che's been killed, and they're hiding it. The government pushed back against speculation, but their explanations lacked the fire needed to calm the masses. Che had been more than a leader. He had been a symbol of purity, incorruptible, fearless, unwavering. Fidel was powerful, yes. But Che was something else entirely. He was a myth. And myths do not vanish without consequence. Political analysts quietly approached Fidel, urging him to share more details to prevent unrest. But Fidel refused. He guarded the secret letter like a sacred relic. Not even Raul knew its full contents. Alone in his office late at night, Fidel read the letter again and again until he could recite every word by memory. The ink began to fade, but the wound inside him did not. One evening, while leaving the council chamber, Fidel paused at the entrance hall where a massive mural of Che stood. The young revolutionary stared back at him with relentless eyes, eyes that had once challenged him, inspired him, defied him. Fidel approached the mural and touched the painted cheek. You should be here, he murmured. At my side, arguing with me, correct me, infuriating me. His voice softened. And yet, you are everywhere except here. The hall echoed his sorrow. A guard walking by halted, unsure whether to announce himself or walk away silently. He chose silence. Some moments were not meant to be witnessed. Meanwhile, in the narrow streets of Havana, the city breathed differently. Poets began writing verses about absence. Street artists painted new murals, some showing Che walking into fog, others depicting him as a star drifting from the Cuban flag. Elderly men played dominoes quietly, conversations subdued. Mothers hushed their children when they asked too many questions about why Che had left. Students whispered in classrooms, trying to piece together a puzzle no one had all the pieces for. Che's departure was not just political. It was emotional, cultural, spiritual. It left a void that no speech could fill. But beneath the sorrow lurked something darker, Curiosity. The kind of curiosity that grows into obsession. Foreign intelligence agencies sharpened their ears. Journalists probed sources. Exiles speculated wildly. Newspapers in Miami and New York published sensational stories. Castro exiles Che after internal power struggle. Guevara dead, Cuban government hiding truth. Secret letter from Che kept from the public. Some of these articles reached Cuba through smuggled copies. Citizens whispered over them late at night with lamps dimmed. And in government halls, Fidel felt pressure mounting. Advisors urged him to release Che's letter, the real letter, to calm the storm. But Fidel refused. Not yet. Not while emotions were raw. Not while truth could ignite fires that Cuba was not ready to face. For now, the letter remained locked in a metal drawer behind his desk. A secret he carried alone. A wound he reopened every night. Days turned into weeks. Cuba learned to breathe again, but not normally, like a patient recovering from surgery, each breath uneasy. Che's absence lingered like a ghost. His children asked fewer questions, but watched the door anyway. Aleida slept little and wrote long entries in her journal. The comrade from the airstrip drank more than usual, haunted by guilt. Intelligence officers monitored the increasingly anxious public. Ministers debated new policies with less conviction than before. And Fidel walked the halls of the palace with heavier steps. He had won many battles. He had survived assassination attempts. He had stared down empires. But nothing tested him like the silence Che left behind. Cuba was still standing, yes, but it was missing its fire. And deep in the quiet of midnight, when Fidel returned to his office and opened the drawer, he would unfold the letter again, tracing the ink with trembling fingers. The flames of the revolution still burned, but one of its brightest lights had disappeared into the unknown. And the mystery of Che's vanishing, and the secret that Fidel alone possessed, was only beginning. The nights in Havana had grown unervingly still in the weeks following Che's disappearance. Even the waves seemed quieter, brushing over the Malecon with a tired hush. Yet inside the Palacio de la Revolution, unrest deepened like a crack running through marble. Fidel paced in his office long after midnight, cigarette burning down between his fingers, ash falling onto the floor unchecked. His desk lamp cast a harsh circle of light, illuminating piles of documents, maps, and intelligence reports. But at the center of it all, lying alone on an otherwise empty stretch of desk, was a single folded sheet of paper. Che's letter. Its edges had begun to curl. The creases had worn almost thin. Fidel had read it so many times he could recite it even in his sleep, though sleep had become rare and restless. Outside his window the city slept, unaware of the storm building inside its leader. Fidel stopped pacing and stared at the letter, his shoulders rising and falling with a deep exhale. He reached for it with a hand that trembled slightly, then pulled back. Not yet. Not again. He dragged another inhale from his cigarette. But the words echoed in his head anyway. I leave because my presence would fracture what we built together. He squeezed his eyes shut. There was no escape. Che's voice followed him everywhere. Earlier that afternoon, a confidential meeting had nearly collapsed into chaos. Senior officials crowded around the oval table, each with a different fear, each with a different demand. Comandante, the rumors must be controlled, one minister urged, pounding a fist into his palm. The people think Che left because the leadership is divided. A foreign paper reported that he was forced out, another added. And the Miami exiles are saying he's dead. A third leaned forward, voice hushed. If we release a statement with more details. No. Fidel's voice cracked like a whip. The room fell silent. Raul studied his brother closely. He knew this tone, the tone of a man masking emotional wounds with authority. Fidel, Raul said gently, the people trust us. But they need clarity. Something. Anything. Fidel's jaw worked silently before he answered. When the time is right, he said. Not now. One general exchanged anxious glances with another. Comandante, is there something more? Something you haven't told us? They all looked at him, Fidel paused. For a moment, his eyes drifted to the inner pocket of his jacket, where the folded letter still rested like a stone pressing against his ribs. Something more? Yes. Something that could ignite the island like dry tinder. But he simply said, "No." After the meeting dispersed, Raoul followed Fidel down the hallway. "Brother," he whispered, "you're carrying something. I don't know what it is, but I see it." Fidel stopped walking. For a moment, he considered telling Raoul the truth. Not the whole letter, but a piece of it, a fragment, a shadow. But then he saw Raoul's face, tired, loyal, burdened already with responsibilities Fidel had dumped on him. No, better to carry the weight himself. He put a hand on Raoul's shoulder. "All you need to know," Fidel said, "is that Che did what he believed necessary." Raoul frowned. "And what do you believe, Fidel?" Fidel didn't answer, because he didn't know. 2 hours before dawn, Fidel finally sat at his desk. He stubbed out the cigarette, extinguishing the last glowing ember with the force of a man crushing a thought he couldn't bear. He unfolded Che's letter slowly, as if afraid it might crumble under the pressure of his fingers. Che's handwriting, sharp, slanted, urgent, stared back at him. "Fidel, I write not as a commander to his leader, but as one man to another." Fidel's chest tightened. "I have reached the limit of what I can do within Cuba. Your revolution no longer needs my presence, it needs my absence." He inhaled sharply through his nose. Absence. That word felt like a blade. "Our visions still share the same horizon, but the paths diverge. You build nations, Fidel. I ignite revolutions." Fidel slammed the letter down. "I could have helped him build both," he muttered to the empty room. He stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out over the dark rooftops of Havana. Lights glimmered faintly across the cityscape. Somewhere out there, people were whispering about Che, debating his reasons, doubting Fidel's story. The truth, the real truth, could destroy stability or strengthen it. It was impossible to predict which, and that uncertainty scared him. Fidel's fear was not for himself. He was used to danger. Assassination attempts were practically a weekly ritual by then. But the fear that clawed at him now was something new. The fear of what Che's honesty could do to a fragile nation. Because Che had not been gentle in his letter. He had called out the rising bureaucracy. He had criticized Soviet influence. He had warned Fidel about complacency. He had urged renewal where Fidel sought consolidation. These were not things Cuba was ready to hear. And Fidel wasn't ready to reveal them. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He returned to the desk and read the next line, the line that haunted him most. "If I stay, I become a contradiction. If I leave, I become a reminder." A reminder of what? Fidel wondered. Courage? Purity? Ideals untainted by compromise? Che had always been the fire. And Fidel had become the architect who needed walls, order, institutions. Fire doesn't respect walls. The next day brought new pressure. The Soviet ambassador arrived unannounced, escorted into Fidel's office with a smile too tight to be friendly. "Comrade Castro," he said smoothly, "Moscow is concerned about the situation." Fidel leaned back in his chair. "What situation?" The ambassador raised an eyebrow. "The disappearance of Guevara, and the rumors it has created. The Americans are exploiting the confusion." Fidel's jaw clenched. "You and your people," the ambassador continued, "should consider releasing a unifying statement." Fidel's silence stretched long. The ambassador pressed on. "And perhaps," he added casually, "it would be best if the more divisive opinions of Comrade Guevara remain private. At least for now." Fidel felt heat rising in his chest. "His opinions," Fidel said slowly, "are not for Moscow to manage." The ambassador smiled politely, but his eyes hardened. "I'm only advising what is in Cuba's interest." Fidel had to fight the urge to throw him out. Instead, he said, "The matter is internal, and it will remain that way." As the ambassador left, Fidel let out a long breath. International pressure, domestic pressure, political danger, emotional turmoil, all because of one letter, one truth. That evening, Fidel walked alone through the quiet corridors of the palace. His footsteps echoed hollowly. He paused before a room rarely used anymore. The old strategy room, where he and Che had once spent endless nights planning battles, marking maps, arguing heatedly over decisions. He entered. Dust coated the long wooden table. Yellowed maps still clung to the walls. A chalkboard bore the faded remnants of someone's handwriting. This room was a cemetery of memories. Fidel walked to the head of a table and touched the back of a chair. Che's chair. He closed his eyes. He could still see Che sitting there, unshaven, eyes burning, fingers tapping restlessly, voice always urgent, always pushing, always questioning, always dreaming beyond what seemed realistic. Fidel pulled out the chair and sat in it. The leather was cold. Ernesto, he murmured into the empty space. You should have stayed. We could have solved our disagreements. You didn't need to walk away. Silence answered him. But the silence felt like Che, stubborn, uncompromising. Later that night, Che's letter found its way back into Fidel's hands once more. He sank into his office chair, hands trembling as he unfolded it. He read the last line slowly, as if savoring an old wound. Our friendship will outlast the distance between us, but only if you allow it. Do not hold my exit as betrayal. Hold it as my final gift. Fidel's throat tightened. Gift. What kind of gift was exile? What kind of gift was silence? What kind of gift was absent? Che's words had cut him, not gently but deeply, the way only a friend could. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, fingers pressed against his temples. Why did you leave without speaking to me? He whispered, voice cracking. Why did you force me to be the one who stayed behind? He took a long, slow breath. The truth was this. Che had always chosen the harder road. Fidel always chose the necessary one. And now their roads had finally split. Irreversibly. At dawn, Fidel stepped onto the balcony overlooking Havana. The breeze carried the scent of sea salt and distant tobacco fields. The city glowed beneath the rising sun. He held Che's letter in his hand. Behind him, aides occasionally glanced through the doorway, waiting for instructions, unsure if they should approach. Fidel stood motionless. He folded the letter carefully, painfully, and slipped it into the breast pocket of his uniform. He whispered, "Not yet," because he knew something the world did not. Che's words were not just a farewell. They were dynamite. And once released, Cuba would never be the same. The moment would come. But not now. Not while the island trembled. Not while he himself trembled. As the sun rose over Havana, Fidel turned away from the balcony and walked back into the shadows of his office, carrying the weight of a truth too powerful to reveal and too sacred to destroy. Havana had not yet recovered from the absence of Che Guevara. Weeks after the clandestine departure, the city moved with a strange rhythm, the streets alive, yet tinged with a collective unease, as if the air itself were waiting for news that might never come. Rumors circulated like wildfire, carried in the hushed tones of neighbors, whispered over cafe tables, and scribbled into diaries no one dared publish. "Did you hear?" one vendor said, flipping oranges in his basket. "Some say he was forced to leave." "Impossible," another replied, counting coins. "Che doesn't run from anything." "And yet he's gone," the first answered. "Vanished like a ghost." The ghostly absence of the man who had been the revolution's fire burned through every neighborhood. And with it came the first tremors of suspicion, inside the government and outside, beyond the island's fragile borders. Inside the Palacio de la Revolution, the pressure was intensifying. Fidel Castro, once seemingly invincible in his command, felt the subtle shift in the air, eyes not just upon him, but through him. Advisors approached with cautious steps, voices softened, words weighed. Everyone knew something was different. Fidel felt it too. The letter's shadow extended beyond ink and paper, a weight pressing on his chest. At dawn, as the pale light seeped through the tall windows of his office, Fidel unfolded the letter yet again. He had lost count of how many times he had read it, traced Che's slanted handwriting with trembling fingers, memorized every word. Each line was a knife, each sentence a confession or a warning. And every reading brought the same bitter ache. the sense of loss not just of a man, but of a future imagined with him. Fidel, I write not as a commander to his leader, but as one man to another. If I stay, I become a contradiction. If I leave, I become a reminder. Fidel's jaw tightened. He had chosen to hide the letter, to keep it secret, yet the very act of secrecy had begun to erode his own certainty. The world was shifting outside, and he felt powerless to control it. By mid-morning, news of Che's disappearance had begun to stir unease far beyond Cuba. Journalists in Latin America were already piecing together fragments, sending cablegrams to New York, London, and Moscow. U.S. intelligence operatives tracked the whispers with the intensity of a bloodhound, desperate to understand whether Cuba was fracturing from within. CIA analysts speculated wildly. Some believed Che had been silenced by internal Cuban politics. Others feared he had defected. A few insisted he was dead. Newspapers, eager for sensational headlines, ran conflicting stories, each more dramatic than the last. Castro's lie? Che vanishes without explanation. The rebel commandante. Guevara's secret mission, Oregon-Cuban conspiracy. Cuba's heart of fire, now smoldering. Where is Che? Inside Havana, clandestine copies of these papers made their way from smugglers' hands to small cafes and university dorms. The words were incendiary, seeding suspicion and fear. Questions began to rise not just in public, but in Fidel's own corridors. Ministers and generals walked with tighter jaws, glanced over shoulders, whispered among themselves. Even Raoul, steadfast as ever, could not mask a subtle tension when he approached his brother. Fidel sensed the walls closing in, and it terrified him. By late afternoon, he was alone in his office again. The hum of the city outside was distant, muffled, almost irrelevant. He sat in a leather chair, the letter once again open before him, hands trembling slightly. He read the line for what must have been the 100th time. Our friendship will outlast the distance between us, but only if you allow it. Do not hold my exit as betrayal. Hold it as my final gift. Gift. The word seemed like a lie, or perhaps a curse. He felt the gnawing weight of responsibility. The letter, hidden though it was more than ink and paper. It was a living thing, a truth so sharp that even the slightest hint of revelation could fracture the nation. It was a weapon, a mirror, and a burden, all in one. And he was its sole guardian. He lit a cigarette and inhaled deeply, the smoke curling in the dim light, mixing with the dust motes dancing in the air. He had survived bombs, bullets, assassination attempts, and the hostility of superpowers. Yet now he feared something different, the vulnerability of holding a truth alone. Evening brought the first direct threats to that solitude. Reports arrived from intelligence channels that foreign journalists had begun asking pointed questions, tracking flights, and interrogating Cuban exiles. Soviet advisors visited, their smiles polite but their eyes calculating, subtly pressing for more information. The Americans were more aggressive, covert channels buzzing with inquiries, rumors, and intercepted whispers. Fidel felt it all like the buzz of insects in a cavern. Persistent, unavoidable, and unnerving. He dismissed the messengers with calm authority, but once alone, the panic crept back. Every knock on the door, every distant footstep on marble floors, every shadow cast by a passing street lamp felt charged with potential catastrophe. Even the guard's loyal, seasoned veterans seemed different. Tighter jaws, sharper eyes, quieter steps. Fidel knew they were not disloyal, but the presence of secrecy made everything feel combustible. And he was the fuse. By midnight, the palace was silent. Only the hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional cough from a distant hallway punctuated the darkness. Fidel paced the office slowly, cigarette dangling from his lips. The letter lay on the desk like a fragile corpse, the weight of its meaning pressing down on him. He paused, staring at the ink as if willing the words to speak differently. They wouldn't. Che's voice was resolute, uncompromising. You are Cuba's leader. I am its soldier elsewhere. Do not mistake my absence for cowardice. Fidel shook his head. Absence. Cowardice. Words that struck at his very identity. He was the leader, yes, but without Che, he felt incomplete, vulnerable. Not because he feared for the revolution, but because he feared the truth. The world might never know. But he knew. And that was unbearable. The days following saw a subtle, but unmistakable shift in Havana. Ordinary citizens, teachers, students, vendors, spoke in hushed tones about Che. The young were more daring, questioning, speculating. University professors whispered in corridors. Street artists painted murals of Che walking into misty jungles, guns slung over his shoulder, eyes blazing. Every image, every whisper, every memory seemed to converge into a collective obsession. Fidel watched it all from his office windows. The city was alive, yes, but like a forest after a fire, vibrant, yes, but scorched in ways only the flames could explain. And in that scorched air, shadows moved. Even within his inner circle, the pressure grew. Advisors debated over what to say, what to conceal, how to control speculation. Some suggested that the letter, Che's letter, be released to calm unrest. Others argued that any revelation would only destabilize Cuba further. Fidel's own conscience warred with him. He could release it, reveal Che's thoughts to the people, the truth of his departure, the warnings, the critiques. But doing so would ignite debates, doubts, and fractures that could last decades. To protect the nation, he had to lie. And in lying, he betrayed the man he had called his brother. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. Late one night, he found himself walking through the Palacio, past the murals of Che painted during earlier years of the revolution. The young revolutionary's face stared back at him, eyes blazing with idealism and challenge. Fidel's footsteps slowed. His hand brushed against the cold, painted wall. "You should have stayed," he whispered into the silence. "We could have argued. We could have built together. But you chose to disappear." Silence answered him. Yet somehow, the absence itself spoke louder than words. By the following week, the whispers had transcended Havana. Exiles in Miami speculated endlessly. Foreign journalists pieced together flight records and unconfirmed sightings. Soviet officials pressed Havana for intelligence, hinting at dissatisfaction. CIA analysts debated whether Che would attempt another revolution elsewhere, South America, Africa, perhaps Southeast Asia. And within the walls of the Palacio, Fidel paced, letter in hand, trapped between duty and conscience, history and friendship, secrecy and truth. The world outside pressed in relentlessly, but he alone held the fulcrum. One wrong step, one miscalculation, one word too many, and the fragile myth of the revolution could shatter. Fidel's mind spun with visions of headlines, uprisings, betrayals, and history books. He felt the weight of generations on his shoulders. Every choice he had ever made, every compromise, every triumph, every decision now pressed against him like a living thing. And Che's absence, and his letter, was the heaviest of all. When the night finally surrendered to dawn, Fidel sat at his desk, the letter open once again. He traced the last lines with trembling fingers. "Our paths diverge, but our cause is eternal. Do not let my absence define you. Define the revolution in your own hands." Fidel pressed the letter against his chest. He could almost hear Che's voice whispering through the words. And he realized the truth. The revolution, the nation, and even he himself were no longer entirely his own. Che had left, but his shadow remained, a ghost that haunted every decision, every thought, every breath. The letter was no longer just a document. It was a pulse, a warning, a legacy. And Fidel knew, no matter how tightly he clutched it, no matter how long he hid it, the world would eventually demand to know. And when that time came, the consequences could be catastrophic. The jungle breathed around him like a living beast, dense, wet, and endlessly hungry. Che pushed a low-hanging branch aside, sweat pouring down his neck, mud gripping his boots like hands refusing to let go. Every step in this foreign land felt heavier than the last. Africa was not Cuba. It was harsher, wilder, unpredictable. He had come seeking purpose. Instead, he found struggle. The air was thick with humidity. Monkeys screeched in the canopy. Farther away, gunfire cracked like dry branches snapping under a hunter's boot. Che ducked instinctively. "Ambush," whispered Mwana, one of the young guerrillas following him. Che shook his head, listening. "No," he said softly. "Training. But poor discipline. They fire without aim." He moved on, jaw clenched. Every day in this foreign war felt like fighting the jungle itself. The rebels lacked resources, discipline, coherent leadership. Many were barefoot. Some carried rifles older than their fathers. The medical supplies he'd brought were already dwindling. Malaria had claimed 3 fighters in a single week. And still, despite the exhaustion gripping his bones, a fire burned in his eyes. A revolutionary does not choose the battlefield. The battlefield chooses him. At dusk, they reached a clearing where smoke faintly rose from dying campfires. Young men and women sat around sharpening rusted machetes, patching torn uniforms, arguing quietly about tactics. Children, far too young to witness war, carried water jugs larger than their torsos. Che's heart tightened. He had seen poverty. He had seen violence. But never had he walked into a place where hopelessness clung to the air like humidity. A commander approached him, tall, lean, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. "Commandante," he said, bowing slightly. "We lost another patrol." Che stiffened. "How many?" "7. Maybe 8. They were ambushed." Again. Che's jaw set like stone. "We need training," he said. "Discipline. Coordination. A revolution cannot survive on courage alone." The commander lowered his gaze. "We try. They try. But hope does not fill stomachs." Che clasped his shoulder firmly. "We will find a way." But even as he said it, he felt a tremor inside, a whisper of doubt. Was he fighting for change? Or chasing ghosts? Later that night, Che sat by a small fire, scribbling notes by candlelight. His handwriting trembled with exhaustion, yet his words carried sharp clarity. The men lack experience, but their spirit is unbreakable. The situation is more fragile than I anticipated. Without supplies and organization, we are fighting a losing battle. He paused, staring into the flames. Should he write to Fidel? It had been weeks since he'd last heard from Havana. The silence was deafening. He dipped his pen again. "I do not know if my mission will succeed, but I know I cannot return. Cuba must move forward without me." The paper blurred for a moment. Not from the smoke, from memory. He remembered Fidel's silhouette framed against the Havana skyline, voice booming, confidence unshakable. The man he had fought beside for years. The brother he had left without a goodbye. Che shut his journal abruptly. Staring into the dark trees, he whispered to himself, This is the path I chose." But even spoken aloud, the conviction sounded thinner than before. Thousands of miles away, Havana was a world of polished marble floors, sharp uniforms, and whispers echoing through halls. Fidel walked briskly through the Palacio's corridors, ministers trailing behind him, carrying documents, intelligence reports, rumors, anxieties. "How many journalists have asked today?" Fidel snapped. 7, Commandante. An aide answered. 1 from Paris. 2 from New York. "The Chileans are speculating." "Speculating what?" Fidel demanded, his teeth clenched. That Che may have broken with the revolution." Fidel stopped. The corridor fell silent. A minister opened his mouth to add something, but the sharp glare Fidel gave him froze the words in his throat. Fidel marched on. Inside his office, he slammed the door and paced furiously. He felt the walls tightening around him, not from danger, but from truth. The letter. The words he hid. The thoughts Che had confessed. The doubts. The separation. The painful honesty Fidel could neither deny nor reveal. He opened a desk drawer and pulled out the folded papers once more. The ink had begun to fade slightly from constant handling. "I leave not out of anger, but necessity." Fidel crushed the letter in his fist. Necessity. To abandon Cuba. To abandon him. He dropped into a chair and buried his face in his hands. The revolution had survived invasions, sabotage, and betrayal. But could it survive a fracture between its two greatest sons? The next morning brought no relief. Raul entered the office quietly. Fidel, we need to talk. Fidel didn't look up. About Che? Raul nodded. Whispers are growing. The Soviets are uneasy. The Americans are making moves. Our allies ask for answers. Our own people, they deserve clarity. Fidel's voice hardened. They will get clarity when I decide. Raul sighed, the sigh of a brother torn between loyalty and necessity. It's not about deciding anymore. It's about reality. Fidel's gaze snapped up. Reality, he repeated slowly, dangerously. Reality is what we shape, what we protect. If the truth destabilizes the island. Raul stepped closer. What destabilizes the island, Fidel, is silence. The words landed like blows. For a moment, Fidel's hand twitched as if he wanted to strike his brother. But then something crumbled inside him, a crack in the armor he had worn since the mountains of the Sierra Maestra. He turned to the window, staring at Havana's rooftops. Raul, if people knew what was in the letter, if they knew Che left because he had to, because he could not stay, do you think they would understand? Raul didn't answer. His silence was an answer. Meanwhile, in Africa, Che stood at the edge of a ravine, wind whipping through the tall grass. His men gathered behind him, their faces painted with dust and fatigue. He surveyed the valley below, the place where they would launch their next attack. Smoke curled from distant huts. Enemy patrols marched with confident rhythm. Che clenched his rifle. "This is where we make our stand," he said. One of the rebels swallowed hard. "We don't have enough ammunition." "We will take theirs," Che replied. A woman stepped forward. "We lost 15 fighters last week." Che looked at her, tired, determined. "Then we must honor their sacrifice." But as he turned toward the horizon, doubt gnawed again at his gut. Was this truly the right battlefield? Was this the revolution he had imagined? He forced the thought away. He had made his choice, and choices had consequences. Back in Havana, Fidel's paranoia grew. With every hour, Che remained silent. He reviewed intercepted communications, foreign broadcasts, and intelligence reports. His nights became restless cycles of pacing, smoking, and reading the letter aloud in the dim light, as if searching for a hidden meaning he had missed before. He imagined Che surrounded by enemies. He imagined Che failed. He imagined Che dead. Every possibility tore at him. One night, close to dawn, Fidel whispered to himself, "Did he abandon the revolution, or did I abandon him?" The question echoed in the empty room like a ghost's laughter. Days later, a coded message arrived in Havana. A field report from Africa. Sparse, incomplete, brutal, supplies low, morale strained, resistance larger than expected. But one line froze Fidel's blood. Guevara remains ambitious, but increasingly isolated. Isolated. The words stabbed him. Fidel pressed the paper to his forehead, eyes shut tight. He wanted to send help. He wanted to bring Che home. He wanted to confess the truth to his people. But every option carried danger. Every choice threatened the revolution. And the revolution was the only thing he knew how to protect. Meanwhile, in the African camp, Che lay awake, staring at the stars, listening to the sounds of insects and distant gunfire. He felt the loneliness of the jungle settle deep into his bones. He whispered to himself, "Fidel, do you read my reports? What do you think of me? Do you wonder if I regret leaving?" A shadow passed over his face, a combination of longing and resignation. He reached for his journal and wrote a single line, "I must accept the price of my convictions." Then he closed the book, extinguished the candle, and let the darkness swallow him whole. In Havana, that same night, Fidel stood on the roof of the palace, staring out over the ocean. The wind whipped at his beard. He felt small beneath the vast sky. He whispered into the wind, "Che, if you die out there, I will never forgive you." But he knew the truth. If Che died, it would not be betrayal. It would be destiny. And Fidel feared, truly feared, that destiny was already unfolding. As dawn broke, two men on opposite sides of the world opened their eyes to new battles. One in the jungle, one in the corridors of power. Both were fighting shadows. Both were fighting themselves. and both knew that their paths, though separated by oceans, were still bound by history, loyalty, love, anger, and unresolved truths. Che marched deeper into a foreign war, searching for purpose. Fidel marched deeper into paranoia, searching for control. Their choices were becoming fuses, their emotions explosives. And soon, the world would ignite. The rainy season arrived with a vengeance. Torrential downpours battered the African jungle day and night, turning the earth into a swamp of sludge and decay. Che's camp, already fragile, already starving, collapsed beneath the weight of nature's cruelty. Tents sagged. Rifles rusted. Fighters grew feverish and delirious. One morning, Che stumbled from his shelter to find two rebels curled beneath a tree, shivering violently. He knelt beside them, touched their foreheads, both burning with fever. "Malaria," he whispered. A third rebel approached, eyes hollow. "We lost 5 more overnight." Che closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling the damp, earthy air. Everything smelled of rot. "Prepare graves," he said softly. The rebel hesitated. "With respect, we have no more shovels." Che clenched his jaw. There were no victories here, only survival. And even that felt temporary. Later that evening, Che stood beneath a tarp, flipping through the last of his medical supplies. Half the bottles were empty. The remaining few held mere drops, not enough for a single day. A voice broke the silence. "Commandante." Che looked up. It was Moana again, thinner than before, soaked from the rain. "What is it?" Che asked. "We intercepted a radio message. The enemy knows your name." Che froze. Moana continued, "They know you're here. Their commanders believe capturing you will end the rebellion." Rain hammered the tarp like bullets. Che wiped water from his face. "So it begins." Moana's voice trembled. "If they find you, they'll send everything." Che adjusted his damp beret. "Then we give them everything in return." But the words tasted bitter, like a lie. Night fell like a curtain, and Che sat alone by a weak fire, his journal open on his knees. His hands trembled from exhaustion, fever threatening to creep into his bones. He wrote, "The men fight with courage, but courage does not fill the stomach nor silence disease. We are losing. I must face the possibility that I miscalculated." His pen hovered. "Or perhaps I have lost myself chasing the ghost of revolution." He closed the journal. For the first time in years, Che felt fear, not of death, but of failure, and of being forgotten. Across the ocean, Havana was a pressure cooker. Fidel's days grew shorter, his nights longer. His ministers brought him reports by the hour: economic troubles, public unrest, foreign suspicion, Soviet irritation, American opportunism. But what consumed him most was the silence from Che. Every morning he asked, "Any word?" And every morning the answer was the same: no. Rumors spiraled out of control. Some claimed Che was fighting in Africa. Others insisted he was sick or injured. Enemy propaganda said Fidel had killed him. The uncertainty gnawed at Cuba's spirit. It gnawed at Fidel's soul. One night after midnight, Fidel sat alone at his desk with a single lamp illuminating the letter. Che's letter, the secret he had guarded with religious devotion. He read it again, slowly, painfully. "Fidel, do not carry me as a burden. Carry me as a brother who must walk another path. What we built together will outlive us. But I must follow my conscience even if it leads me away from you." Fidel felt the words scrape against his heart. "Away from you," he whispered into the empty room. "Why, Che? Why didn't you argue with me? Why didn't you stay and fight me? Why did you leave me with this silence?" The letter did not answer. It never had. Raoul entered without knocking. He saw the crumpled letter in Fidel's fist, saw the exhaustion etched into every line of his brother's face. "You cannot keep torturing yourself," Raoul said. Fidel's voice cracked. "He might be dead, Raoul, and I will never know." "You will," Raoul said firmly. "We have scouts, allies, contacts in Africa. We will know." Fidel shook his head. "If he dies, the world will blame me." Raoul stepped closer. "If he lives, the world will still blame you." Fidel let out a breath, half laugh, half sob. I do not care about the world, he whispered. I care about him. Raul rested a hand on his shoulder. Then prepare yourself, he said softly, because news is coming. Fidel closed his eyes and waited for the inevitable. Che's strength waned. The rebels dwindled from hundreds to dozens. The jungle turned from enemy to executioner. One night, after a skirmish left 2 dead and 6 wounded, Che collapsed beside a rock, clutching his ribs. Blood seeped between his fingers. Moana rushed to him. Comandante, you're hurt. Che grimaced. A bruise. Nothing more. But when he coughed, blood flecked the mud. Nothing, Moana repeated, unconvinced. Che forced himself up, swaying. Help others first. Why do you do this? Moana suddenly burst out, eyes wet. You could have stayed in Cuba. You could have lived. His voice cracked. Why this? Why here? Che stared into the young man's eyes filled with desperation and devotion and confusion. Because injustice is born wherever we ignore it, he said quietly. If I stayed in Cuba, I would be comfortable. And a revolutionary cannot be comfortable. But you will die here, Moana shouted. Che placed a hand on his shoulder. Then I will die with dignity. The jungle swallowed his next breath. Weeks later, during a failed ambush, enemy troops surrounded Che's dwindling band. Gunfire tore through the trees. Grenades exploded, sending dirt and bark raining from above. Che fired back, but his asthma seized him, his lungs tightening. He gasped, leaning against a tree, struggling to breathe. Moana dragged him by the arm. Comandante, we must retreat. Che pulled free. No retreat. They will kill us all. Che gave a faint smile. Then let them. An explosion rocked the forest. Branches fell. Smoke choked the air. And then silence. Che's vision blurred. Shapes moved through the haze. Enemy soldiers. Boots stomped toward him. Rough hands pulled him up. A rifle, but smashed against his head. Darkness swallowed him whole. Che awoke in a small mud brick hut. His hands bound behind him. Blood crusted on his forehead. A lantern flickered, casting shadows like ghosts on the walls. A soldier stood guard. Che tried to sit, pain slashing through his ribs. His breath rasped. The door creaked open. A Bolivian officer entered. He stared at Che with a mixture of awe and hatred. So, he said slowly, the legend bleeds like any other man. Che smiled weakly. Legends bleed more. The officer struck him across the face. You are finished, Guevara. Che spat blood. No. Ideas never finish. The officer leaned in. Your ideas die tomorrow. Che closed his eyes, not in fear, but in acceptance. Havana woke to gray skies. A chill wind swept through the streets. Fidel entered his office, expecting another day of reports and rumors. Instead, Raul stood waiting, pale, tense, silent. Fidel's stomach dropped. What is it? He asked. Raul handed him a single sheet of paper. Intercepted intelligence. Unconfirmed, but unmistakable. Ernesto Che Guevara captured. Fidel read the words once, twice, 3 times. His hand trembled violently. Captured. The one thing he feared most. His breath strangled in his throat. Raul spoke quietly. We don't know if he's alive. Fidel slammed his fist on the table. We must send help, immediately. Diplomats. Envoys. International pressure. Anything. Raul swallowed. It may be too late. Fidel grabbed Raul by the collar. No, not him. Not Che. His voice cracked. If he dies, Raul, I will never forgive myself. Raul held his brother's trembling arms. We will try. Fidel's voice dropped to a whisper. And if we fail? Raul hesitated. Fidel didn't need the answer. He saw it in his brother's eyes. The morning was quiet. Too quiet. Che knew what that meant. The officer entered the hut with 2 soldiers. He did not look Che in the eyes. Any final words? He asked. Che nodded. Tell my children I love them. Tell Fidel he will understand. The officer swallowed. Che added softly. Shoot. Cowardice is harder to bear than death. The officer stepped outside. A new soldier, young, terrified, entered with a trembling pistol. Che looked at him with compassion. "Do not be afraid, Iho," he said. "You are killing a man, not a dream." The soldier's hand shook. Che lifted his head. "Shoot," he whispered. A single gunshot echoed through the valley. Silence followed. Heavy, eternal. Che Guevara was gone. The news reached Havana 3 days later. Fidel refused to believe it. "No," he whispered. "Propaganda. Lies." But then came photographs. Clear. Undeniable. Che's lifeless face, eyes half open, resting on a stretcher like a crucified martyr. Fidel fell to his knees, the letter clenched in his hand. A primal cry tore from his throat, a sound that echoed through the Palacio, through Havana, through history itself. It was a cry of grief, and guilt, and love. Hours later, trembling, he walked to his balcony. A crowd had already gathered outside, thousands silent, waiting. Fidel raised the letter. "The world has lost a revolutionary," his voice wavered. "Cuba has lost a son." His hands shook violently. "And I have lost my brother." He unfolded the letter before the people, the letter he had kept hidden, guarded, agonized over. And for the first time, he read Che's final words to Cuba aloud. Tears streamed down faces in the crowd. Men and women sobbed openly. Students raised their fists. The island mourned as one heart. Che's words became scripture. His absence, legend. His death, resurrection. Years passed. Cuba changed. The world changed. But the memory of Che Guevara remained untouched, suspended in time, immortal. Fidel aged, his beard whitening, his posture bending. But every October, on the anniversary of Che's death, he locked himself in his office with the letter. The paper had grown fragile, the ink fading. But the words still burned. He would whisper the final lines. "Fidel, if history judges us, let it judge us by the convictions we carried, not the mistakes we made." Then he would press the paper to his forehead, eyes closed. And for a moment he became the young man from the mountains again, standing beside Che, planning dreams, dreaming battles, believing in the impossible. One night, many years later, after everyone else had left, Fidel sat alone in the quiet office. He opened the letter one last time. The ink was faint, almost gone, but he knew the words by heart. He whispered, "Forgive me, hermano." The wind rustled the curtains. And for an instant, just an instant, Fidel thought he heard a familiar voice whisper back, "We finished the journey together." He closed the letter gently and let the past rest. History would argue endlessly about Che Guevara, hero, villain, idealist, failure, martyr, dreamer. But the truth lay somewhere deeper. He was a man who refused comfort in a world built on it. A man who chased justice into jungles that swallowed him. A man whose convictions were so fierce they consumed him. And Fidel, the survivor, the architect, the keeper of the letter, carried the weight of that fire for the rest of his life. Che vanished from Cuba, but he never vanished from its soul. His final letter became a relic, his death a legend, his life an echo that refused silence. And somewhere in the quiet corridors of memory, the revolution still whispered his name. Che, the man who walked into the wild fire and became eternal.